Okay, so as people start to log on, I just want to ask everybody to please to turn off your video. If you have any questions during today's presentation or anything you'd like to ask the senator, please go to the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen and you can type your questions there. And please know that this webinar is being recorded, so we wanted to make sure you're aware of that. I'm Mark Blattner. I'm the president and CEO of the Jewish Federation. And we're really honored to have United States Senator Jeff Merkley joining us to help give an Oregon view from Washington, D.C. of what's taking place. Senator, let me just tell you a little bit about what our Jewish community has done since the virus has impacted all of us. We have been very successful in raising over $800,000 as a Jewish community to support Jewish organizations in town. Through the Paycheck Protection Program, we've raised close to $6 million for Jewish organizations in town, so we're grateful for that, a major support and effort. But we recognize there's a long road ahead. The virus isn't ending tomorrow, sadly, and we're going to have to make sure we do all we can to keep everybody in business and doing the work that they do. Senator Merkley has been our United States Senator since 2009. Prior to that, he was the Speaker of the Oregon House of Representatives. He currently serves on the Appropriations Committee, the Environment and Public Works Committee, the Budget Committee, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He has his wife, who's a nurse, along with his 2 children. And we just welcome you, and I'll turn it over to you for any opening comments.
Mark, thank you so much for the invitation, and to the Jewish Federations for setting all of this up. It's a pleasure to be with you. I know it's afternoon, late afternoon in Oregon. It's getting to be evening here. I just have spent so much time over these last 6 weeks talking to different communities throughout our state and different groups throughout the country as we try to find our way through this uncharted territory. Who could imagine that following MERS and SARS, which fizzled out, that we would have a cousin that would wreak so much damage. About 66,000 Americans have now died from this disease. I think we're about 1.2 million infections and counting. And we may have a lot of this with us for some time to come. And then on top of that, that this particular type of healthcare crisis triggers an economic implosion of catastrophic proportions. We didn't have an implosion that happened this fast in terms of employment in the Great Depression. It didn't happen anything like this in the 2008-2009 Great Recession. In that recession, we were losing about 1% of our employed Americans per month. We have just seen 30 million people lose their jobs in 6 weeks. And tomorrow we'll probably hear in the weekly report that comes out on Thursday mornings that another 3 or 4 million, something like that, several million more will have lost their jobs. So this implosion is overwhelming our systems. Our response was to, as a Congress, was to say, let's push to save this economy from the ground up. Let's save the small businesses and nonprofits. Let's create a robust unemployment system so that those that we can't help stay open and are laying people off, that those folks will have the money to pay their rent, their mortgage, their utilities, their bills, so we don't see a cascading domino effect that brings down the entire economy in an even more drastic fashion. So that was the heart of the Paycheck Protection Program. We've gone through 2 iterations of it. We had challenges with it. We found that in the first set of money, larger companies tended to figure out and have the ability to apply more quickly. They got through the front door. They tended to have stronger banking relationships, so the banks and credit unions favored those longtime customers. The second iteration, we set aside $60 billion for underserved communities, and $30 billion of that has to go through small banks and credit unions that serve those underserved communities, trying to make sure the door is open to every organization. Everyone needs to be helped on this. Meanwhile, on the unemployment side, we did several things. We said, let's make unemployment insurance available to gig workers, let's contract workers, sole proprietors, who would not normally be covered by unemployment. Let's add $600 per week so that it's enough money people can pay their rent and their utilities, and so their family doesn't go under. Again, prevent a domino impact, help people at the grassroots level. Other aspects of the effort were to shore up our state and local government. So funds were dispersed for that, not nearly enough, I'll come back to that. Shore up our healthcare system. So we sent $100 billion in the last Corona bill, 3.5, and we're trying to make sure more of that gets to our rural hospitals and clinics, which are hemorrhaging cash and have little reserves to rely on. We cannot let this crisis tear down our healthcare system that serves all Americans. Now, I'm back here in DC after 5 weeks in Oregon, had the pleasure of getting on the plane. I had a couple masks, including this one that says Timbers on it, and this is my cedar mask. So feeling like a real Oregonian, as protected myself from infection on the plane. Wore this on the floor twice today to vote. We're here, in my mind, what we should be doing is forging Corona 4. We know that state and local governments are going to need a lot more help, somewhere between half a trillion to $1 trillion, because of the massive loss of revenue. For many states, that's sales tax. For Oregon, it's going to be income tax, and we expect that a lot of property taxes for local government will go down as well. We have to make sure that the fundamental services in housing, education, healthcare that states do continue to be functional. We have a challenge in that. The leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, has said his response is let the states go bankrupt. That is not a solution that serves America. As we look to Corona 4, in addition to state and local governments, we're hoping to establish vote by mail, so nobody has to worry about getting sick, being forced to go to a poll in November. Ron Wyden and Amy Klobuchar have an excellent comprehensive bill on this that I'm happy to co-sponsor, and I salute their efforts. I also have a backup strategy because I have a feeling the comprehensive strategy is going to run into a lot of trouble. My backup strategy is, say, at a minimum, guarantee everyone in America access to an absentee ballot. Every state has an absentee ballot program. Some of them have a lot of qualifications. So strip those qualifications away, enable everyone to sign up and get that absentee ballot at a minimum. I hope we can get the broader vote by mail, but there's serious resistance from the president and from the majority leader. They do not like the idea of vote by mail, and you may wonder why. And the answer, I'm sorry to say, is because polling places are very easily manipulated in elections. You can understaff them. You can decrease the number of them. You can change the locations of them. And you can use that fact to make it hard for people to vote. And those voter suppression tactics are undone by vote by mail. And my Republican colleagues in the leadership, at least of the Republican Party, want to keep those powers available to what I consider are corrupt practices. So that's the battle we're facing there. I also want to push to make sure that utilities are not cut off for families during this crisis. People need to have basic utilities, including broadband access. And for those who can't afford it, we need to help people get that coverage during the crisis for their children who are going to school over the internet, for themselves looking for work and so forth. The internet's just become essential. And so I think that I will just stop there and turn this over to all of you, your questions, your comments, your insights. It's very valuable as we ponder how, in fact, to get through this, to hear from all of you about your ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Merkley. Bob, our JCRC director. Bob, you want to start with some questions?
Be happy to. So thank you, Senator. You get on here. Hopefully I will not freeze. And if I do, Mark will jump in. So you mentioned the underserved communities that have not been able to access the PPP loans. I saw a statistic, for example, that the African American businesses that have applied for the loans. 95% of them have been rejected. I mean, what can be done? And the same is true for the Latino community and even the Asian American community. What can be done to mitigate that problem?
Well, so we need the institutions that serve those communities to be able to greatly increase the number of loans that they're doing. And these, by the way, they're called loans, but they are really grants. They should be called grants. As long as the money is spent on payroll and basic expenses such as your utilities, your supplies, your rent, then it's not money that has to be returned. So that's extremely important for these small businesses. So having that $60 billion set aside for loans in those or grants, PPP grants, in those underserved areas is essential. Now, we haven't had time to see how much that's resolving the problem. But my hope is we'll start to see reports in the next week or two that those who applied in those underserved communities that didn't get through the first time are getting through now. And part of that isn't just who the loan or grant recipient is, it's also what is the institution. So by requiring $30 billion to go through very small banks and credit unions that serve those communities, hopefully we will really have screened off competition from stronger, larger groups. Everyone who applies should be funded. And if we run out of funding, we're going to have to put more funding into it. But we've got to be able to help all of those small businesses that you're speaking to.
Okay, so you mentioned also the support for states and local governments. I think I heard New York City is in debt by something like $8 billion. And the idea that any major cities or states would go bankrupt, I mean, what would be the impact on our economy if that were allowed to happen? And why do you think Senator McConnell, I mean, his state is not immune to this issue either. So what's really going on there?
I wish I understood better McConnell's thinking on this. There is an anti-government bias embedded in the DNA now of the new Republican Party. To some degree, that goes back a long ways, but generally it tends to be, hey, we would prefer state government over federal government. And this is McConnell and the federal government saying, let's let the state government go down and local governments go down. So that's why I'm surprised by his position. If we think about, for example, with Oregon, where a lot of funds go into Medicaid, we have coordinated care communities that are providing health care throughout the state. Well, what if our match goes down and we can't match? What happens if our efforts to fund K-12 now has to drop by 20%? How do you have larger classrooms than we already have? And Oregon has the largest, I think we're close to the top in the size of classrooms that we have, a number of children per classroom. Well, that's not an environment you can learn in. In fact, we have this situation now where we may need to have far fewer children per classroom, which will be much more expensive just in order to, as a protection against communication of the disease through children. So our education would be compromised, our healthcare system would be compromised, there will be no funds for transportation. I think that would have to be shut down completely. That affects the construction industry. I think just the ripples would deeply damage everything in the state, and in that sense have a profoundly negative impact on the economy.
So you were talking about things that Congress can do to help ensure free, fair, and accessible voting. We had a question: is there any leverage that vote by mail supporters in Congress have available to increase the chances of adoption of a vote by mail system?
That is a question we're all asking. What leverage do we have? Because it's so completely unfair to have people feel like they have to risk their health to vote. Our leverage, any bill has to pass the Senate. So what leverage do we have in the Senate if we have the majority party determined to block it? And the answer is that the bill also has to pass the House. And where there is a pro vote by mail or pro absentee ballot community. And so that's our leverage. The House is our leverage. And deals will be made that will not make either side happy. And that's where I said we've got a robust vote by mail bill. I'm trying to make sure there's at least a fallback that possibly can be part of a compromise. But it's going to depend on how determined the House is. What I'm concerned about is repeatedly when the president has laid down a line, Mitch McConnell has said, that line I will follow, and I'll follow it absolutely. And the president has said, spoken very publicly about his opposition to helping people vote by mail in the November election. He sees it as central question of maybe could affect whether or not he wins re-election. So I think, and Mitch McConnell has just taken that up and said, I will stand with the president on this. So it's, I feel it's going to be a big challenge. We have to get a presidential signature. We've got to get through the Senate, some leverage in the House, but I don't know that we have enough.
So getting back to the SBA loan program, one of our synagogue execs is asking, he points out that the opportunity for forgiveness is challenging because you have 2.5 months calculation to receive funds, but only 8 weeks to actually spend, and it doesn't match up in what he says are the best of circumstances. So how do we deal with that problem?
Yeah, the 2.5 week calculation was confusing because the basic premise was we will provide 100% of your payroll and another 25% on top to help cover rent, supplies, utilities, other expenses. And so in order to explain to people how much money they would get, that translated into 2.5 months that you have to spend in 2 months, which confused everybody. But here's the challenge. It took so long to get this program rolling and out the door that so many small businesses said, we've just got to lay people off. We're not confident that the program will open. We're not confident we'll qualify. We're just not confident the money will show up in our account. So they laid people off, and the goal was to keep people on. So now they're going, well, we've laid people off, so we don't really have a payroll now that can possibly enable us to spend this money in the 8 week period. And I think we really have to evolve in terms of flexibility of this program. I think it's got to go from the initial vision, which was how do we keep people from being put on unemployment to begin with, and instead to be how do we help small businesses reopen when they're ready and able to do so. And so I think we have to create a lot more flexibility about how those funds are spent. That will not have a profound impact on the employees if they've been laid off, and with that extra $600 per week, they're earning, in most cases, as much as they would have earned employed. But what it does mean is then there'll be extra money to be spent in a far more flexible way to let small businesses open up. So that's one of my goals with PPP is flexibility. And I should say, changing the flexibility on state and local funds is also essential because the money that has been allocated under the rules that says it can only be spent on expenses related to the coronavirus, not for revenue replacement. Well, if your revenue is plummeting, that means you could pay for coronavirus expenses, but have everything else you do collapse, which would take us right back in the discussion we were having. So we need a lot more flexibility for state and local governments in utilizing those funds.
Okay, we have one of our participants is thanking you for supporting the Healthcare Emergency Guarantee Act. She wants to know, how are you working to encourage others in the House and Senate to support this vital measure that will ensure healthcare coverage for all during the pandemic?
Yes, so this is a bill that basically says, let's take the existing system and know that there are many people in the cracks who do not have insurance right now. Even in the best effort to deploy the ACA, we always had at least 1 out of 20 Americans who did not have health care coverage. And let's just say through the pandemic until we get to the other side of this and restabilize, everyone's automatically covered who's in those cracks, who doesn't have coverage right now. It's a Bernie Sanders bill in the Senate. I don't remember who the House leaders are. I'm proud to co-sponsor it. Right now, we need to be, I think we need to have a simple, seamless system where we're all covered all the time just by virtue of living in America. That's what virtually every developed country has. So the whole stress of how do I rearrange healthcare when I move, and when I change jobs, when my income fluctuates, and now I'm on Medicaid, but now I don't qualify, or now my employer covers my spouse and my kids, but now they don't. All of that stress goes away in a comprehensive system. And so I hope we get there. This is different because this isn't saying a comprehensive system. It doesn't replace anything anyone has now. It says, let's fill in for those who are not covered. And the momentum is going to have to come from the House side. The House side is going to have to pass it, adopt it, and press for it in negotiations with the Senate.
Okay. So as you know, there are a lot of recent college graduates who now would love to be working for work, but prospects may be dim, and they also may have accumulated large amounts of student debt, loan debt. Is there any progress on legislation to either defer or eliminate federal student loans?
Yes, in a previous bill, we did defer payments for, I think it was a 6-month period. However, there's much more robust legislation that I'm co-sponsoring that would take $10,000 off of every student loan in America. What that does is for many, many people, it means their student loan debt would be obliterated, meaning that they are now free to buy more goods, buy homes. Home ownership is the biggest driver of middle class wealth in America. Get married, things that have been profoundly impacted by the weight of student debt on their shoulders. The cost of tuition in Germany, it's zero. And even when they had a tuition, it was small, and with living expenses for college, it was still a fraction. I think it was 5% of the average middle class family income in Germany, where our debt ratio for or cost for a year of college compared to a family's income was 50%. So far more of a burden. And we're doing this at a time when college is much more important than it was a generation ago in terms of the types of jobs available for people to fulfill their potential and for their own life and contributing back to the economy. So that's some of the more aggressive side of the strategy on student loans. We do have an option for income adjusted loans that is very poorly circulated. I had legislation for it that then Obama did a rule that actually created that program available to everyone for income adjusted loans to try to lighten the burden. But you would never know that this exists through most servicers. They're not in the business of helping people get the best option. So having a streamlined income-based repayment would also help. There's other things that can help as well. One of the things that Elizabeth Warren and I have pushed for is that the interest rate the big banks are getting should be the interest rates what the students get when they borrow from the federal government, which would mean instead of 6 or 10%, it'd be right now 1 to 2%.
Very good. So we still have a lot of questions about the elections. And one of the things that we're all concerned about, especially those of us in Oregon who vote by mail, is funding for the U.S. Postal Service and whether there are concerns about them running out of money. And it doesn't seem like the administration is very supportive of making sure that that doesn't happen. So what's going on that front?
Yes, so the post office has on paper been running in the red for some years because we use mail so much less. Many of us pay our bills over the internet through our checking account electronically rather than sending off checks. We write less personal letters, so on and so forth. So that has an impact. Plus, in a previous administration, there was a rule that said you had to account for the future retirement benefits in a present basis manner that drove the on-paper debt or deficit for the post office up a lot, but that was an accounting maneuver, not a reality in terms of cash flow. I think we will be successful in keeping the post office funded. It's often noted it's the one government department mentioned in the Constitution. It still plays an absolutely key role. When President Trump said, I will veto any bill that funds the post office unless it has, I think it was a fourfold or maybe even a fivefold increase in fees, I think let's just call that a Trumpism. If it's something he asserted because he doesn't like the post office, he doesn't like their partnership with Amazon, and he likes to kind of give speeches about that. But funding the post office as part of a larger funding package, which is the way all funding bills are done, I don't think for a moment the president is going to torpedo a bill that is has that many other things he supports, but also I just don't think he'd want to take responsibility for taking down the post office.
Let's hope not. So we have some non-COVID related questions. We're going to get to those, but I'm going to stick for now to the COVID related questions. A lot of questions, as you might surmise, about testing. I mean, when do you think we will see testing capacity to the point where people can actually feel confident going out in public?
So there is a strategy to being able to reopen the economy that depends upon TNT, like dynamite. In this case, the TNT is testing and tracing. We haven't come close to the amount of tests that we need in Oregon or in any state to be able to proceed to have anyone who has a symptom get tested, to try to then anyone who tests positive to be able to send out a team to trace all of their contacts, get them tested, and then go the next generation, the friends of the friends that may have been in contact with folks, including folks who are asymptomatic but can spread the disease. That sort of tracing and testing requires a lot more tests. Right now, we're running about an average of about 55, on a 7-day rolling average, about 55 new infections a day in Oregon. It's been very flat for 2 weeks. It's not declining. And if you multiply that, if somebody's had contact with 20 people over the time of an incubation period, and then those folks, you have to test beyond that. So you're talking about adding several thousand tests a day to do serious tracing. What will come from that is we will understand exactly how people are getting infected. We have a notion about it now, but not a complete sense. How many folks is it happening in homeless communities? Is it happening in farm worker housing? Is it happening in prisons? Is it happening in retirement homes? Is it happening with people who are positive, infecting their family members? And how do we attack each of those settings? Well, one thing is to trace everyone down and everybody who's positive, make sure that they're fully engaged in a 14-day quarantine. This has worked. This example has been set forth in South Korea, and they are at the point they have essentially no new domestically generated infections. They've had infections brought in by people traveling from abroad, but then they catch them and they find them and they quarantine them. And so they are in a very different place. I also think we have to think about another component of this, which is what lessons can we learn from those businesses that have been open as essential. So when you go to the grocery store and not all grocery stores are firmly doing this, but some are firmly enforcing one way down the aisle, wear masks, their clerks are wearing masks, the checkout counters have plexiglass around them. If we can find through contact tracing that nobody's getting infected in those settings, then we can take those practices and apply them in other settings, knowing that people are essentially going to be safe. But the foundation is testing and tracing. Now, why don't we have enough tests? Well, it's because the president didn't take this infection seriously and didn't gear up national production. He wavered from saying the federal government's totally in charge, don't worry states, to saying the states are totally in charge, you all go compete with yourself. He never activated the Defense Production Act in any serious manner for testing. And so our testing gear up has been much slower than many other countries. Didn't use the Defense Production Act for protection, personal protective equipment, PPE. So that's been a big challenge, and that's essential as well. I know in my own family, I've seen this through the eyes of my son and my wife. My wife, as mentioned, is a nurse. She's a hospice nurse. She goes into homes where people are extremely sick. Often other family members are extremely sick. Some have COVID. And initially, the protocols just weren't there. She didn't have masks. She didn't have gowns. She didn't have training. That has changed and greatly improved. My son was working in a doctor's clinic and initially did not have a mask at all. And so with there too, the protocols have changed. But we've got to have the tests, the tracing, the protective equipment as a foundation, as well as apply the lessons learned from existing retail.
So just as a sort of follow-up, how would you delineate the responsibility of the federal government versus the state governments? There's been a lot of tension when it comes to supplies, PPE, testing equipment, that sort of thing.
So this is a national challenge. The disease doesn't know state boundaries. It should have been an absolutely intense, robust national plan from the beginning with the partners of the states in implementing that plan. That is the way essentially every other government that's been successful in dampening the curve or proceeding to effectively, aggressively tackle this has done it. And the result of the chaos in the US is we now have, I think 66,000 people have died, 1.2 million infections. I think we now account for 1/3 of the identified positives in the world. So this is a failure of federal government to have a cohesive federal strategy and work in partnership with the states to implement it. Some cases when things go awry, we say, well, that's a delay, that's a frustration. In this case, a lot more people have died than should have if we had had the aggressive, coordinated federal strategy.
So we have a participant asking about, we know that there's coordination among some of the governors who are, thankfully, I think, resisting the premature opening of businesses. Is there a similar coordination among members of Congress in this fashion?
Well, in terms of whether the premature opening of Congress, I think is the gist of the question.
No, premature opening of states, whether, yes, in Congress, whether there's similar coordination amongst congressional leaders to try to get states to adhere to the guidelines rather than, I think the term that Dr. Fauci uses was leapfrogging.
I would say mostly the answer is no. That you have the leadership in the Senate wanting to essentially restate the president's view. And the president's view has been, yes, follow practices. Oh, by the way, go out and experiment with opening up as quickly as you can. And it's kind of been a do this, do that. Again, lack of a cohesive federal plan. And I think the gist of it is there was an inclination in the Senate leadership to not want to push to say, have a carefully implemented plan based on what we've learned from essential retail that's open now and a foundation of testing and tracing, because they feel that there is a grassroots movement associated with the Tea Party and the base of their political party that is saying this is all rubbish, let's just get out there and open everything up. So there is not a cohesive congressional support, but you do see Republican governors and Democratic governors really working together on one particular thing, which is the state governments need and local governments need a lot more support. That's a place where we really do have bipartisan support from outside of DC, but we still don't have bipartisan support inside DC, but I'm optimistic we will get there.
Okay. How can we get ICE to release detainees is a question we have.
Elect a new president. Steve Miller is the voice of trying to blame everything that happens in the world on immigrants. And, you know, this is very personal for me because it was the middle of 2018, almost 2 years ago, when I became the first member of Congress to go down to the border and see the children who had been torn out of their parents' arms, locked up in those wire cages inside of a warehouse. And then to go up to the former Walmart and find out that hundreds of separated children, boys, were locked up in there. They didn't let me in the door, but the fact they didn't let me in the door created a national awareness that something was horrific was going on. And I proceeded to visit homeless camps across the border, visit the children prisons that the Trump team had set up in Homestead, in Florida, and Tornillo in the desert in Texas. I went to Central America. I approached the border from both sides to understand what became known as metering, in which essentially we were violating and continue to violate the Refugee Convention. People come up to our door saying, I'm asking for refugee status. We are obliged under our law and international law to say, come across, we will offer you safe refuge while you pursue your asylum claim. That is gone. We are stiff arming and leaving people across the border. So this same mentality of attacking immigrants is being used in almost weekly announcements of some new thing, like, well, you can't immigrate into the United States unless you have health care insurance. Well, who in poor countries fleeing persecution has health care insurance? Very, very few people. Oh, now we've sealed the border completely. Well, we'd virtually sealed it already, leaving families without friends or funds stranded in very dangerous cities on the border on the Mexican side. Rapes, assaults, kidnappings, extortions, but it's out of sight because it's not happening in the US now. It's happening across the border in the Mexican communities. So Steve Miller is very much in charge of this. He has the president's ear. They want to make things as horrific on immigrants as possible. So we have no real path to pry open the doors. I mean, we've sent letters, we've proposed bills, and I say we, lots of members of Congress have weighed in publicly with every bill, but we have no tool to make it happen. And Steve Miller has the tool to keep the doors locked.
Unfortunate. So we still have a lot of questions. We have about 15 more minutes, so we're going to try to get through as many as possible. We had some SNAP, I think, has been underfunded even before this crisis. You know, someone was asking, well, it's great that food banks need their support, which they do, but what about SNAP?
So we're pushing for, we did get an increase in SNAP, and we got some support to transfer the school programs into electronic credits so that families could go buy groceries to help replace the lost school meals. What we're trying to get a 15% increase in the maximum amount a family could get to help with hunger across the nation. You have lots of folks who have not come close to getting their unemployment insurance who are unemployed. That system has been overwhelmed by the numbers of applicants. Plus, we did things to expand it that the state computer systems that administer it weren't prepared for. And our state system in Oregon is written in COBOL. It takes me back to the Fortran days when I was programming for the Defense Department. I mean, it's like a generation ago. So the state's trying to hire coders to be able to say, okay, yes, we can take entrepreneurs, contract workers, gig workers who are authorized under the federal law to apply. But they're being told at a minimum 6 weeks, and it could be longer because of this overwhelming challenge of how many people, how quickly have become unemployed. So what that means is, while they may get money retroactively, right now they don't have money for their rent or for their groceries, and SNAP is absolutely essential in that. So Debbie Stabenow as head of Ag and on the Democratic side, and myself as the head of the Ag Spending Subcommittee of Appropriations, are pushing for this 15% increase. We lost in Krona 3.5. I'm sure hoping we can win in Krona 4.
Okay, great. I know our community would support that. In a crisis like this, it can bring out the best of people, and unfortunately can also bring out the worst in people. We've seen a lot of cyber hate. Clearly some of that has been directed at the Asian American community, but we've also seen an uptick in anti-Semitism. What is being done about that?
Yes, and one of the forms in which this is happening is Zoom bombing, where people take control of Zoom rooms and put horrific graphics up on the page in the middle of meetings. I got a note right as we were starting this Zoom room from my technical staff saying, quickly try to upload the new version of Zoom that protects against some of the hacking. And I wasn't able to do it before we started this conversation. But this challenge runs so deep, but often it runs hidden below the surface. And then there are moments when it comes onto the surface, in part because they see leaders who find it acceptable for people to engage in prejudiced, hate-filled action. When my first experience in life that I saw this was when I was an intern for Senator Hatfield in 1976. Bicentennial summer, we're celebrating 200 years of America being a country, and I'm assigned to come in an hour early and open all the mail. And there were about 100 letters a day that Senator Hatfield would get. And I had to open it and then stack it and then sort it for 4 different legislative correspondents, which meant I had to scan each letter for the content. And I'm opening this mail and I'm seeing attacks that I had never heard in my life. Attacks on African Americans, Asian Americans, Latino Americans, and then all kinds of attacks on people of different religions, Jewish Americans, Seventh-day Adventists, Mormons, so on and so forth. And I was stunned to read this. Also, a lot of attacks on Senator Hatfield, saying, well, you say you're a Baptist Christian, but I disagree with you on X, Y, and Z. If you were truly a Christian, you'd have this other view. So you must be a pretend Christian, which means you're the devil. I mean, it was just, there was so much hate in that mail that I had just never witnessed growing up in a blue collar community on the east side of Portland, as well as being down in Roseburg. And I realized how much must exist that's hidden. But when people wrote letters, it became unhidden. And now we have had a period in which first it became convenient to use racist attacks against President Obama in order to discredit him. So he's born in Kenya. He's controlled by Muslims. I heard all the time in letters being written to me. He's not a real Christian, even though he claims to be, so on and so forth. And then we had the Trump campaign, which attacked virtually every single group possible in the course of the campaign. Women, veterans, people with disabilities, African Americans, Asian Americans, Haitian Americans, kind of being particularly Muslim Americans. And this has just given a tremendous number of Americans a sense that it's okay for me to harbor these thoughts and to express them. We need national leadership, all of us who are in the public world. Every time we see a group attacked, we have to say we are going to stand side by side with that group, arm in arm, and we're going to say we are all Americans together. we honor religious diversity. We honor and appreciate ethnic diversity. We appreciate the fact that we are a nation of immigrants and honor the immigrant experience as contributing to America. And it's only by having that be the theme that overtakes the let's blame this group or that group, I think that we're going to start to see this change.
As we say,
it's hard to believe that we're where we are now.
From your lips to God's ears, because this is obviously a very big concern in our community. Okay, we only have a few more minutes. We had a question that was a couple questions about, as you might expect from the Jewish community, about Israel. What are your views of the Trump peace plan? And also, there's a rumor that the Secretary of State may be going to Israel. If you could answer those in fairly short time, and we can get to a couple more questions.
I met with Jared Kushner to go over the plan that he had put together, along with a couple other members of the Foreign Relations Committee. And he kept saying, we're offering a lot of money to people on the West Bank, and that will solve everything. I believe that's a complete misreading of the dynamic. This isn't an issue simply of if you pay someone enough, the problem goes away. So I see little momentum for that plan in terms of a lasting resolution to the challenge. That's my short version answer.
And have you heard that the Secretary of State is going there in the near future?
I had not heard that. We are trying to get Secretary Pompeo to testify before the Foreign Relations Committee. That was routine for like every administration in my lifetime. It's no longer routine. The president has opposed having people. There's a fundamental problem here of the relationship between Congress and the presidency, because the sense of checks and balances means that Congress has the ability to have a dialogue and bring members of the administration to express their views, answer questions, and have that happen before the American public as a form of information gathering and exploring answers and solutions to challenges. And when the administration says we don't want people to go testify before Congress, that's a problem. And so we've seen very, very little of Secretary Pompeo and more of him than a number of others, like the Homeland Security Secretary and so forth. So this is a challenge that we saw highlighted when congressional subpoenas for individuals were then rejected by the administration, and the courts have not seen fit to enforce them. And that means Congress now has no tool to actually even compel members to come in when the administration says too bad. This is pretty damaging to the checks and balances system. But I'm going way beyond your question. But in essence, no, I hadn't heard that he was going to Israel.
Okay, well, so we know there's a lot of tension between, say, the administration in terms of the politicians and the scientists. There's a question here: is there any way to protect government employees with high-level positions from being fired when they produce information that does not match with the administration's views?
Well, so we've just seen a series of inspector generals who have been fired. The whole idea of an inspector general is to have someone who looks into the internal workings from the executive branch side of, and then shares that with the American public to help create accountability that the executive branch is implementing programs in a legal fashion in accordance with guidance from Congress. Those are positions the president they're not Senate confirmed, so the president can fire them and replace them. And so that is, some may be Senate confirmed, but they're not all Senate confirmed. No, that's a real challenge. The whistleblower laws took a huge blow when, after the impeachment process, the president just started firing people who had essentially been whistleblowers on the concerns that led to the House impeachment and the Senate trial. So that has had a big impact suppressing. So the laws designed to protect whistleblowers aren't working really well.
It's unfortunate. So we are just about out of time. Senator, I would like to have you close with any remarks you would like, and then I'll turn it over to Mark Blattner. Thank you for your time.
Oh, you're welcome. And thank you for having this forum. And I hope we continue to do things like this on an occasional basis. Especially because I can't hold my town halls right now, not in-person town halls. I have had most, I think I got, of the 36 counties, I think I got about 22 done before this was hit. So I'm doing electronic town halls, county by county, but also trying to do broader forms of this nature as a more regular rhythm. Please be in contact with my team. On this call, Allison, who is working with these issues on the policy side in DC, is on this call. You can follow up with her, Allison Hunn. Jake Okenberg, who is my business liaison, is on this call. You can follow up with him. He's in Oregon. Either of them can get me on the phone, and of course, Bob knows how to dial me up directly, so can use that channel as well. I am profoundly disturbed by where we are as a country. I wrestled with whether to run for re-election because the Senate is so dysfunctional as a legislative body. I first came here in 1976 as an intern and saw a legislative process that looks a lot like the way the Oregon legislature works. That is that essentially no one blocked amendments, bills weren't blocked from getting to the floor, the supermajority was virtually never used. So just as the founders had said, beware of the damage a supermajority will do because of their experience with the Continental Congress. Yet here we are now, 4 decades later, and the Senate is paralyzed and massively partisan. I am trying to drive an effort to take on some fundamental corruption in our system, the gerrymandering, the voter suppression, the dark money. I feel like this is essential if we're going to hope to reclaim the vision of government by and for the people rather than by and for the powerful. Everywhere you look, you see the impact. You see of what has transpired. You see that court appointments and tax cuts for the wealthy take a simple majority in the Senate, but good policy on healthcare, housing, education, or for that matter, bad policy, on infrastructure, on equality, on taking on environmental issues takes a supermajority. And so that creates a bias against those fundamental efforts on healthcare, housing, education, and so forth, in which the Senate is completely dysfunctional. So I'm trying to take on the corruption. It's called the For the People Act. Tom Udall and I were the co-pilots. He was the pilot, I was the co-pilot. This cycle, he's leaving. I'll be driving this next time. It's passed the House. It's H.R. 1. I wanted to mention this because I feel like so many of the things we care about depend on restoring the Senate as a functioning legislative body, able to actually address issues Americans face. And so that's my prayer and hope that in January and February of next year, we'll be able to pass that bill and have a series of other changes. We have no current desire for a bipartisan vibe in the Senate from Mitch McConnell. He wants to do things that drive us into our respective camps. And let me compare this for a moment. When I became Speaker of the Oregon House, I changed a whole bunch of rules. I had folks by seniority chose seats on the floor, but I asked them to choose seats where they had the maximum number of people of the other party surrounding them. I held bipartisan lunches every Friday in my office with 4 Ds and 4 Rs. Can you imagine Mitch McConnell doing outreach in that fashion? We required people to sit DR on committee. Created teamwork bills to say if the Democrats and Republicans were working together, there's 4 sponsors, 2 of each party, was guaranteed, the bill was guaranteed a hearing, and so forth. There's none of that from the leadership in the Senate, and then the supermajority just puts everything on ice. So my hope is some of these issues that we're facing can include having leadership visionary enough in the Senate to restore it as a functioning legislative body and to embrace the idea of discouraging the tribalism we're locked into right now. That tribalism is reinforced by the urban-rural divide. It's reinforced by social media. It's reinforced by the cable television being over to the left and over to the right. But at least there's things we can do inside this institution to make it work better for all Americans. So in addition to the substantive policy, it's my hope that we can be a better institution in delivering solutions for all of America. Thank you again for your time, and please stay healthy and take care.
Senator Merkley, it's needless to say you have your work cut out for you, but we very much appreciate all you do for the country and for the state. And I'll turn it over to Mark to wrap it up.
Senator Merkley, listen, thank you very much. We appreciate your leadership in Washington, D.C. on behalf of the citizens of the state of Oregon. We're grateful for the work that you're doing. Thank you for your time today. I'm sorry we didn't get to answer all of the questions that were raised on the chat, but we hope to have the opportunity to do it again. And I just wanted to say, I hope that you get to enjoy a nice dinner tonight, since it's dinner time for you, and that you stay healthy and well. And hopefully we'll see you back here in Oregon soon enough. But we're grateful for your time. And I just want to let everybody know on the call that next week, U.S. Senator Ron Wyden is going to be joining us. We'll hear from him as well. And that'll be at 1:00 p.m. next Wednesday. More information to come tomorrow. So wanted to let you know that. Senator, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Mark. Thank you, Bob.
Okay. Be well. Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.